U.S. President Donald Trump's Middle East envoy told families of hostages being held by Palestinian militant group Hamas on Saturday that he was working with the Israeli government on a plan that would effectively end the war in Gaza. In a recording of the meeting reviewed by Reuters, Witkoff is heard saying, "We have a very, very good plan that we're working on collectively with the Israeli government, with Prime Minister Netanyahu, for the reconstruction of Gaza. That effectively means the end of the war." Witkoff also said that Hamas was prepared to disarm in order to end the war, though the group has repeatedly said it will not lay down its weapons. Witkoff has also said that Hamas was prepared to disarm in order to end the war. I do not believe that one tiny bit. In response, Hamas, which has dominated Gaza since 2007, but has been militarily battered by Israel in the war, said it would not relinquish armed resistance unless an independent, fully sovereign Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital was established. Okay, that is a complete non-starter. In response, Hamas, which has dominated Gaza since 2007 but has been militarily battered by the Israelis in the war, said it would not relinquish armed resistance unless an independent, fully sovereign Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital was established. Okay, there are multiple aspects of this that are complete non-starters and will never, ever happen, okay? First off, the idea that Jerusalem is going to be the capital in some new Palestinian state or whatever is just laughable, okay? Even under the original 1947 British agreement that established Israel and the state of Palestine, Jerusalem was a neutral city because it has such significant religious importance to both Islam and Judaism and Christianity that it is such a holy site, it's such an important historical city that it's really important that it remain at least somewhat independent and not under the control of explicitly theocratic people like would be the rulers of the new Palestinian state or whatever, okay? So first off, the idea that Jerusalem would be their capital is a complete non-starter. But also the idea of a fully sovereign Palestinian state, I think at this point is completely a non-starter as well. I mean, ever since October 7th, I don't think the Israeli government or the Israeli people have any interest in allowing the Palestinians in Gaza to have their own independent state, right? They just had the biggest terrorist attack they've ever experienced on October 7th. They had thousands of people bust down the fence and flood across and start killing hundreds and thousands of random Israeli civilians that just happen to be there, and a whole bunch that just happen to be at a music festival, right? When something like that happens, especially after all of the conflict that, for the decades that led up to that, I think means to me that to the extent that maybe a two-state solution was possible prior to October 7th, I think that it is basically off the table now, at least for a decade or two. And I think totally reasonably so, right? I wouldn't expect, in response to a terrorist attack of that scale, for Israel to just be like, oh, you know what? Now's the time to give them their own independent state. Now's the time to give them even more power and even more capacity to inflict damage and destruction upon us. So I think a fully sovereign Palestinian state is pretty much out the window, right? The idea of a two-state solution, I think, is gone. And the idea of making them independent, well, this is a statement from Hamas, okay? So Hamas only envisions an independent Palestinian state where they are in control, right? So independent in this sense inherently means controlled by Hamas, right? And that's just never going to happen, right? And I think rightly so. The Israelis should not let a Palestinian state develop that Hamas is the leadership. I don't care if the Palestinians elect them democratically on a vote of 90% to 10%. You can't have Hamas, a terrorist organization who has vowed the destruction of Israel, to take power and give them the power of a whole independent nation. That there's no way. All of that is non-starters, okay? The independent part is a non-starter. The fully sovereign Palestinian state part is a non-starter. And the Jerusalem as its capital is also very much a non-starter. So I don't... The idea that Witkoff also said that Hamas was prepared to disarm in order to end the war, but then also says all this completely undermines what you're saying. This dude's just spouting nonsense. I think Witkoff knows that there's no fixing all of this and that he's just there to he's an actor, right? He's there to pretend. Indirect communications between Hamas and Israel aimed at securing a 60-day ceasefire in the Gaza war and deal for the release of half the hostages ended last week in deadlock. On Saturday, Hamas released its second video in 2 days of Israeli hostage Aviatar David. In it, David, skeletally thin, is shown digging a hole, which he says in the video is for his own grave. A senior Israeli official said an understanding between Israel and Washington was emerging, that there was a need to move from a plan to release some of the hostages to a plan to release all the hostages, disarm Hamas, and demilitarize the Gaza Strip, echoing Israel's key demands for ending the war. Well, okay, I don't know how interested in Israel really is in ending the war, though, right? I don't think they're terribly interested in ending the war. I think they're interested in gaining control of Gaza. And as the Netanyahu administration and parts of this Trump administration have expressed already, they're interested to some degree in ethnically cleansing the area. They're interested to some degree in kicking out all the Palestinians and claiming the land for their own for at least partially real estate interests. They've talked about wanting to, all the beachfront property and making Gaza the Riviera of the, they want to make it into a big casino or whatever. So I don't know if they're super interested in ending the war. But they want to end the war, but they want to end the war in like a very specific, in a very specific kind of way. But I think to some extent, especially Netanyahu himself, benefits from the war continuing, right? He is a security-based president. As far as I understand, he hasn't done a very good job economically or with healthcare or with basically any part of being the prime minister except for security, right? That's his whole shtick is obsessing over security, and whatnot. And so he very much benefits from this war continuing. I would imagine that if the war were to stop, the desire for the Israeli people to keep him in office would be almost completely gone, right? If they believe he's doing a bad job in every way, shape, and form except for security, then when the security issue is mostly taken care of by the war ending, then there's no real reason for him to be in office much longer. So, I question just how much they really want to end the war. And when I say Israel, I'm not talking about the people, of course. The people want the war to end regardless of how it happens. They just want the killing to stop. They want themselves to feel safer. The Israeli people want the end of war. I'm more talking about the Israeli government, the Netanyahu administration, the cynical parts of the government that aren't exactly explicitly interested in ending the war for ending the war's sake. They're interested in ending the war for cynical, personal gain's sake. On Tuesday, Qatar and Egypt, who are mediating ceasefire efforts, endorsed a declaration by France and Saudi Arabia outlining steps towards a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. As part of it, they said Hamas must hand over its arms to the Western-backed Palestinian Authority. I don't think a two-state solution works now. I think after October 7th, I think even before it, you could make an argument that a two-state solution wasn't very viable. But now I don't think it's a question of viability. Now I think it's a question of genuine security, right? You can't have something like October 7th happen and then within just like a year or two, you give them everything they've been wanting. You give them full autonomy, you give them full sovereignty and the ability to have their own military and whatnot. Like that is a serious, legitimate security concern from the Israeli perspective. So I think the idea of a two-state solution is sort of out the window right now. But also, I think based on their own terms, this sort of two-state solution idea, it would not work necessarily, right? On Tuesday, Qatar and Egypt, who are mediating ceasefire efforts, endorsed a declaration by France and Saudi Arabia outlining steps towards a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And this is the important part that is not going to work. As part of it, they said Hamas must hand over its arms to the Western-backed Palestinian Authority. There is absolutely no way that they are ever going to do that, right? Hamas wants to be the leadership of Gaza, right? To the extent that Gaza ever has any chance of becoming a sovereign, independent state, Hamas wants to be the leaders. They are the power. They are the power in Gaza right now. They hold, to what extent, to the small extent that power exists in Gaza, they hold it and wield it. And they aren't just going to give it away to the Palestinian Authority. They've already talked about how like they are much more extreme than the Palestinian Authority. And like they are, Hamas is interested in the destruction of Israel to an extent that the Palestinian Authority is not. And so this is just a total non-starter, right? Hamas will never agree to give over its arms to Western-backed Palestinian Authority. To them, it's no different than disarming directly to the Israelis or the Americans. And they've already said they are not going to disarm. So this seems purely performative, right? There's just a whole bunch of white people in France that feel, they watch too much weird liberal media, and they feel just terrible about what's happening in Israel, and their critical analysis skills of the geopolitical situation there just completely goes out the window in favor of people starving. And right, people starving is terrible and should be like the top priority of everything, and we should be taking care of that above all else. But it also, you can't like completely throw out geopolitical analysis and how all of these things work together, right? This is just a complete non-starter and almost seems entirely performative. The crisis in Gaza has also prompted a string of Western powers to announce they may recognize a Palestinian state. Dozens have died of malnutrition in recent weeks after Israel cut off all supplies to the enclave for nearly 3 months from March to May, according to Gaza's health ministry. It said on Saturday that it had recorded 7 more fatalities, including a child, since Friday. Israel blames Hamas for the suffering in Gaza and says it is taking steps for more aid to reach its population, including pausing fighting for part of the day in some areas, airdrops, and announcing protected routes for aid convoys. Yeah, it is. I mean, Israel always does that, right? They're always just going to explicitly point to, Hamas as the reason for the starvation and the deaths and everything that's going on in Gaza. And definitely to some degree that is correct, right? There's definitely a grain of truth in that. If Hamas was really interested in the Palestinian people, then they know that if they lay down their arms and capitulated fully to the Americans and the Israelis and the UN or whatever, that they possibly could get their two-state solution, which would be in the best interest of the Palestinian people. They could come in and provide much more aid trucks and ensure that some mass starvation doesn't happen. So to the extent that Hamas has the ability to like lay down their arms and do all of that and improve the situation, they do hold some blame. But I think it is a little bit, you're going too far if you lay all of the blame at Hamas's feet, right? It takes two to tango, and Israel has the capability to do more. Now, we can question whether it is their duty or right to do more, but I would argue none of that really matters from like a geopolitical perspective. I just care about morality, right? If Israel has the capacity to go in and without all that much cost or strain to them, go in and ensure tens of thousands of people don't starve to death, it is the moral imperative, is their moral duty to do so, especially if you put in religion into all of this, but I'm not going to do that. Israel definitely holds some amount of blame, right? You can't have a war where there's an extreme power difference, right? Israel is much stronger than Hamas. They come in, they basically level the place, and then say, oh, for these 5 or 6 different complicated reasons, these people, we have these mass starvation, and there's nothing we can do because our hands are tied in these 5 or 6 different ways. Well, I don't think that's super compelling, right? Yeah, it's complicated, but like you have the ability to go in there and do something for these people. UN agencies have said that airdrops of food are insufficient and that Israel must let in far more aid by land and quickly ease the access to it. The Gaza war began when Hamas killed more than 1,200 people and took 251 hostages in an attack on southern Israel on October 7th, 2023, according to Israeli figures. Israel's offensive has since killed more than 60,000 Palestinians, according to Gaza health officials. According to Israeli officials, 50 hostages now remain in Gaza, only 20 of whom are believed to be alive. So yeah, the idea of a two-state solution, I think, is completely unviable. So yeah, I think this whole trying to, France and Saudi Arabia coming out and supporting an independent Palestinian state or whatever is entirely performative for all of these reasons, right? Hamas is never going to lay down their arms, especially to the Palestinian Authority, to the Western back, because it might as well be the same as capitulating and laying down their arms and surrendering to the Americans or the Israelis. To them, as it is the Palestinian Authority, it might as well all be the same, right? The idea of an independent, sovereign Palestinian state post October 7th seems not only a non-starter, but non-viable, at least for 10 or 20 years before things calm down quite a bit. And probably the biggest non-starter of them all is with Jerusalem as their capital. Why would the Palestinian state have the right to Jerusalem, right? I'm not necessarily saying Israel has the right to Jerusalem. I might be in favor of some weird plan where you make Jerusalem an international city and it's not officially overseen by the Israeli government, or it's not officially part of Israel proper. Potentially, I could be in favor of something like that because Jerusalem's important to basically all religions, all Western religions. the idea that like Israel would ever give it up willingly is hilarious. First off, they never will. But the idea that like that the Palestinian state is owed Jerusalem, or that they have some special claim to it as a city, as a capital, that Israel or some other state in the area wouldn't, is just crazy. I think all of this is a complete non-starter. It's a very complicated situation.